Welcome to everybody. I didn't realize last time because maybe it was a bit Waldorf dreamy, whatever, but I didn't realize the time shift we have now in Germany. So for many people from abroad, maybe they don't come in because they are not aware of that time shift we have in Germany. So sorry for that. I just forget about it. I realized it myself on Saturday evening. So Sunday morning, I was aware of that. But of course, that was a bit late, and I didn't realize that it's necessary to tell you. But anyway, now we are 76 people here. People are joining. I'm happy you are with us, all of you. And of course, the video is for all of you. So people who can't join in because they don't get the information for that, they can see the video. And we just, I asked Laura about the download numbers of our videos, and it's between 500 and 1,500, while Christoph is leading right now. But anyway, he started the series, so he's ahead of us in time to do that. But of course, there is no competition around it. Before we go into the lecture and I start to say something about Douglas, who is presenting today, I would like to give the word to Melanie from Brazil.
Thank you, Jost. Good afternoon or evening or morning for you all. Jost gave me this 5 minutes, no, not 5 minutes, 2 seconds, just to tell you that we have a congress going on in Brazil now on the 4th, 5th and 6th of November with the idea is the environment and education. This is the big theme that we are going to work in these 3 days. And we have some beautiful talks from Alan Kaplan from South Africa, and on Friday from a politician, a Brazilian politician, is ex-Waldorf a student, and she is in politics, also working with environment and education. And on Saturday, we will have someone from an NGO that works with education and environment, Jonas Bach. He was already at Alanus also, and he works with anthroposophy.
Yeah, he did a PhD about Waldorf. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then also an indigenous will be at this round table on Saturday. I will put the link in the chat, so if someone has interest, it's in Portuguese. Just the talk from Alan Kaplan is in English. The rest is all in Portuguese. Thank you, Jost, for this.
Yeah, thank you, and good work with your conference. I think it's good. There is the Glasgow meeting of all the politicians, so you're just in time with your conference topic. Wonderful. And I'm happy to announce now Douglas Gerwin for his lecture today. And Douglas is a former Waldorf student from Canada, and he has a PhD in psychology and phenomenology. And for 21 years, he has been Waldorf high school teacher, and this is also the topic of his talk today. He's speaking about adolescent development and the Waldorf high school experience, so he's quite an expert on that topic. Furthermore, he is the head of the Center of Anthroposophy now for 25 years. It's a teacher training center in Amherst in the US. And he is the head of the president of the Research Institute. And I'm happy to join him as a board member in that American Research Institute. And we meet at least when it works, when there is no COVID, we meet at least once a year to our board meetings in Amherst, which I really enjoy to take part in. And he's also a member of the faculty of Antioch University, where there is a master program for Waldorf education. And he has published several books, so he is really an expert about Waldorf and is doing talks all over the world and is doing teacher training. As I said, his topic today is about the Waldorf high school experience, and I'm very happy to have you here, Douglas. Please start your talk.
Glad to do so, Joost, and glad to be with you. And thank you for those kind words of introduction. Though I recognize that in Waldorf circles, if you're called an expert, that's often a warning sign that you're too narrow in your particular interest. I will try and broaden the topic again this afternoon, focusing on adolescence, but nonetheless coming to the question of the relationship of the teenager to education of Waldorf in general. Thank you also, by the way, Laura, who is standing by to do some little technological tricks along with Katarina. Also, thanks to those speakers who've gone before, because you, in many ways, you set up the themes I'd like to develop here, having to do then with the task of education. That's the basic overarching theme here. And as Joost has hinted, I hope to link that general theme more precisely to the nature of the teenager and adolescent development and how we can be helpful there through our Waldorf educational programs around the world. So with that as a kind of background, I would mention one other obvious point, and that is, as you've heard from Joost, I'm speaking to you from Amherst in Massachusetts, the center of 5 universities as it happens to be. And therefore, the perspective that I bring on adolescence will be obviously North American. And yet some of the themes I bring may be of relevance around the world, as I hope you will hear. My intention essentially is to try and cover 4 very general areas today, starting then with this theme of the task of education and its specific relevance to the teenager. And that'll take me to a second thing, which is a survey which the Research Institute for Waldorf Education, you've heard that Joost is a trustee of that organization. The Research Institute has done a recent survey of Waldorf graduates from North American high schools. That will then take us to a third part of this afternoon or evening for you, or morning perhaps for some of you, a third part having to do then with the teenager in the times of COVID-19 and the pandemic that is still gripping us around the world. And to finish then, I will circle back to the theme of task of education with specific reference then to 3 kinds of intelligence that we may be helpful in cultivating, especially then the third kind of these 3. But first, I'd like to set the tone for this talk by offering you an excerpt from a poem by the American poet Judy Sorum Brown, and she entitled this poem simply Fire. But this poem has 2 voices, and therefore I'm so grateful to have a previous speaker in this series, Peter Lutzke, to join me to give you at least a burst of this particular poem. And so if we can have Peter join me on the screen as a duet here. There he is, some of you left and right, in my case up and down. So I'm looking down on him right now, but that's not in any way meant to be evaluative. I'm joined gratefully by Peter, and we will offer you then at least the part of this poem Fire by Judy Sorum Brown. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space.
Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would.
So, building fires requires attention to the spaces in between.
As much as to the wood.
When we are able to build open spaces,
in the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel.
And absence of the fuel together.
Together.
That make fire possible.
That make fire possible.
Thank you, Peter. So with that as the kind of poetic background, I'd like to move now to the first part of this talk. And here I'm going to begin by reminding you that in September of 1920, Rudolf Steiner returned to Stuttgart, and the purpose for going back to Stuttgart was to give another series of talks on child development, following then on the first series of the previous year, which we used to know as Study of Man in English. Now it's called the First Teachers Conference. And in that return to Stuttgart in 1920, Rudolf Steiner got very busy and was unable to give the lectures he had intended to give, and therefore could only give 4, very brief but potent lectures. And this lecture, along with others, I have included in the list of references that Laura will very kindly put into the chat, or at least into the reference box for this talk. So in English, these 4 lectures, these so-called aphoristic lectures, are known as Balance in Teaching. And in a footnote to the second lecture, which has to do with 3 fundamental forces in education, in a footnote which was captured by one of the teachers, Caroline van Heidebrandt, the teacher with a squeaky voice we heard, and also then by the stenographer, she captured then what Rudolf Steiner did as he tried to describe these forces. At a certain moment, he stopped speaking and he slipped into gesture. And he offered 3 gestures for the 3 phases of education. The first gesture I can offer you here, and I must say the words are a little bit unclear, but they have to do with this. And I invite you to join me. What is it like if you put your fingers together? In one version, they touch. In another version, they may not touch. They simply lean toward each other. And notice what mood, perhaps, comes across you in that gesture. This is the gesture he offered for the kindergarten teacher or the preschool educator, bringing the child into the world in a mood of what he called reverence. As you may know, some kindergarten teachers say their relationship to the young child is they kneel before the young child, not in worship, but in reverence, because what's coming into the world is so magnificent. This huge, large being trying to find its way into this tiny little body. First gesture. Now for the second gesture, I have to stand up, and I hope you can follow with me, and maybe you can also stand up if you can, because the second gesture is quite different. I trust you can still see me and with luck still hear me. And the second gesture that Rudolf Steiner offers, now this time for the grade school teacher, if you can see it in the stenographic record, is described as a half B in eurythmy. So imagine now one arm coming out and embracing, like so. Once again, coming out and embracing. And again, if you can attend to the mood that goes with that gesture. Notice it's only one arm, not 2. That would be something else. That might be strangulation. No, this is another gesture, a gesture that's sometimes called the gesture of protection. Now we come to the high school, and there Rudolf Steiner offered a quite different gesture again, not a gesture of kneeling, not a gesture of standing, but a gesture, he says, where you take the right arm and you let it rise up. I'm off the screen in my hand, but nonetheless, it rises up, and in rising up, the hand is open or even pointing. So you might even imagine the finger going beyond the hand. And I don't know about you, but I find in this third gesture, it's no longer enough to stand. It's almost as though I have to take a step into the gesture, and the gesture goes off the page, goes off the screen. You can imagine it rising into the distant future. Those are 3 gestures. Now, I'd like to offer you a moment in the chat to see if you could give us some adjectives of what is the mood you have with that third gesture by comparison to the first gesture, the one gesture of reverence. Another way to think of that is a gesture that says, you are welcomed here. We want you here. You're welcomed here. The second gesture, then this half B, this gesture of protection, is a way of saying, you are safe here. It's like having a harbor, and the boat is in the harbor, but the harbor is open, so you can venture out and venture back. But nonetheless, the gesture is of protection. And now if you wish to add to the chat, what might be your description, your adjective to characterize this third gesture, the gesture that swings out and points off the screen, off the page? Take a moment if you wish to do that. Yeah, it certainly has confidence, strength, intention. Go for it, release, go ahead, it says, explore indeed, fly indeed, and in freedom. That's an important detail. And the fact that you can do it, you offer confidence in that gesture. A freedom, as again mentioned, adventure for sure, and so on. You get the idea. In other words, these three gestures, welcome, safe, and launched, you might say, sent off in this gesture of freedom, or as Rudolf Steiner says, in the gesture of, in German, Schwung, one of those words that cannot be translated like Weltanschauung. You simply have to know what the German means, and if you don't, follow the gesture. Or if you can't follow the gesture, follow the sound. Schwung. It goes somewhere. It has that life to it. So these three gestures are a way of characterizing the task of education now in three different ways. And notice that the first two ways, that is to say, the first way having to do with reverence, the second with protection, is basically working out of what the child has brought with it, often therefore out of its past or its family. By contrast, if you think of the gesture of the teenager, this is in a certain sense not so much working out of their past, although that continues. More and more, I would say, the gesture is working into their future, or maybe pointing to their future, or even better, drawing something of their future towards them. And puberty is, you might say, the inflection point when you switch from teaching primarily out of the given and the past and increasingly into the unknown future. You may remember that Peter Lutzke spoke a bit about the prophetic nature of teaching. This is an example of that. Now, you will be familiar, if you study any physiology, that we have 9, actually 10, but 9 bodily systems. 3 focused up here, 3 more or less in the middle, and 3 more related to the lower organism. And in a conversation with a medical doctor once, he said to me, if you want to understand how an early childhood child learns, young kid, preschool kid learns, study the nervous system, not the structure and not the consciousness, but the process by which the nervous system works. And how does it work? Well, if you think about the nervous system, it's true that in the case, say, of the eye, we have eyelids which can partly close the sense impressions, but even then you're sensitive to light. But we have no earlids, and all the other senses are wide open. That is, through our senses, the process is we simply take the world in and in some mysterious way replicate it without really changing it. That is why sometimes teachers will speak of the young child as teaching or learning through this imitative function, the capacity to take the world and simply be it, in that sense, to imitate it. By contrast, said my friend, he said, if you want to understand how the grade school child learns, then you should study the respiratory and circulatory systems, the middle systems, the breathing systems. And the difference you understand is that these two systems, lung and heart, they are partly open, the lung a bit more, the heart a bit less, but they also have the function to close somewhat. And that's the difference, and you may notice in the lower school child compared to the preschool child. Yes, they're still open to the world, but then they can also find a way to close. You've all had the experience, I'm sure, of watching a young child fall over, hurt itself, cry. But then there comes that magical moment in which the child falls over, hurts itself, and holds in the tears, will not cry. They're discovering the difference now between an inner world that is partly closed and the outer world to which they still have access. Or you may have had experience as a parent that the child discovers to its delight that it can lie and you, the parent, don't know that the lying happened. And you might even, as a child, remember that delightful moment when you discovered that there was an inner world as well as an outer world. And your parents were not omniscient. They could not get into your world entirely. You could, through this small fib, I hope it was small, through a fib, you were able to shut it off. There, the beginning of distinction between an inner and an outer world, still in a way imitating that world, but now the imitation has gone inside, often in terms of fantasies and games and all kinds of imaginary beings, siblings that you create. And in this way, this is not so much learning by an imitative process, it's more by learning through what I call emulation. Not so much imitation, but emulation, meaning that you create inwardly these pictures, and very often these pictures are something bigger than you are. It's one thing to imitate something less than you are, much more interesting to imitate something that's bigger or older or maturer than you are. I wonder how many of you, when you were children, used to dress up as your parents. I used to do that when my parents went out. I would go into my father's closet. I would take out his oversized shoes. I'd take his top hat. In those days, they had top hats. Take out his top hat, his frock, his top coat, and I would walk around the house like a penguin in this oversized clothing, pretending to be something bigger, emulating something bigger than myself. And finally, then comes the high school. For me, most mysterious of all, my friend said, if you want to understand how the teenager learns, you have to understand how metabolism works. How does metabolism work? Well, time is short. Let us say that metabolism requires three things. First, the world you take, you don't imitate it. On the contrary, you break it down. Catabolism. A third element is, out of what you've broken down, you build yourself up. But the mystery is, when you build yourself up, not catabolism now, but anabolism, when you build yourself up exclusively out of your own material. There is no hint of what you've eaten in your skin, for example, unless you're ill. That's different. Or if you've taken drugs, that's different. But normally, under circumstances, whatever you catabolize, before you can anabolize yourself, there is a middle between these first and third moments. A moment we call not catabolism, not anabolism, but this magical moment of metabolism, where what you've taken in has been completely destroyed in order that you can take up what you have destroyed and build yourself. As one of my teachers was fond of saying, you are not what you've eaten. That's the good news. You are not what you've eaten. You are what you have destroyed in what you've eaten. That's who you are. So these moments of catabolizing and metabolizing in order to anabolize. When it comes to learning, one can say the same thing about the teenager. They do not learn by imitation unless they're making fun of you. And they don't even learn entirely by emulation, although they continue that to a degree. No, I have to say, if you want to characterize adolescent learning, it's not so much imitation or emulation, it's more annihilation. That is to say, completely breaking down, and rather than making pictures out of what they receive, the teenager has fully to make it him or herself. It's a bit like fire, which requires the logs, but also the space between the logs in order fully to destroy, in order to create light and warmth through metamorphosis. So with that now, I'd like to turn to a second part, having to do then with a survey which the Research Institute ran of adolescents and how they learn, specifically in Waldorf schools. And for this now, Laura, I ask you to pull up the PowerPoint, and we'll start in with the first slide.
Yes, right away.
There we go. This was the survey of Waldorf graduates by the Research Institute, as I mentioned. And at the moment, one can say that there are about 120 Waldorf schools in North America. 40 of them have high schools, so roughly 1 in 3. We're talking here the independent Waldorf schools. There are also about 4 public Waldorf high schools at the moment in North America. This particular survey was of about just over 1,000 of our graduates, and we surveyed the most recent 25 years of our students. So it was from roughly the years 1990 through 2015 or 2017. We interviewed, we had 2 separate surveys, one to interview those graduates still in university, still in college, roughly 18 to 23 or so, and then the second group taking a similar survey. They were older, they were after college, they were into their career already. That was the survey of these roughly 1,000 graduates. Next slide then, Laura. Conducted, as I say, this survey by the Research Institute for Waldorf Education. And it was a follow-up to a survey we'd done 10 years earlier, just after 2005. And Ida Obermann may remember helping with that particular survey because she was very useful in making some sense out of the statistics that we gathered at that time. I'll come back to that. But both that earlier survey and now the new one we've just completed asked three essential groups of questions. The first questions had to do with their educational life, the second with their professional life, and the third with their more personal life, including their views of their experience as Waldorf teachers and also their experience or their views on anthroposophy. To guide this particular survey, we had a leading thought, which the next slide will illustrate. Taken from Rudolf Steiner, and again, you may have echoes of this from Peter Lutzke's talk a few sessions ago, to say that in education, we have to recognize in children a preview of what must yet be developed. That is to say, we must learn to educate prophetically. Now, in doing this survey, we tried also to dispel three myths, I'll call them, three myths of Waldorf education. And before I get to the first myth, I just will mention that to understand a bit these myths and to understand what is specific about Waldorf education, we tried then to compare some of the answers from the Waldorf graduates to graduates from other independent schools in North America who belonged to the National Association of Independent Schools, or NAIS. The first myth we tried to dispel was the myth that Waldorf schools, or if you go to a Waldorf school, you will be prevented from majoring in science. Let's go to the next slide. Because, as you'll see, in comparing Waldorf graduates, that is to say college, the most recent graduates, to other graduates from other independent schools, you can see that the number majoring in so-called STEM, which is, as you know, science, technology, engineering, and math, the number majoring in these STEM subjects in college is about the same, regardless whether you come from a Waldorf school or another independent school. Not surprisingly, you would see among the Waldorf college students more major in the humanities than in other independent schools. By contrast, you can see that half or fewer Waldorf graduates major in business and finance compared to other independent schools. Now, this equality, this equation of studying science in college between Waldorf schools and other independent schools, this was not always the case, as the next slide will show. In the earlier survey I mentioned a few minutes ago, the one that Ida helped us with, there we established, this was a survey of going right the way back to the first Waldorf graduating class in America of 1943, and that was surveying basically 50 years of graduates. There, only 12% of them had majored in STEM. However, if we look at the more recent graduates, those who graduated from a Waldorf school between 1990 and 2010, that number has risen to 17%. As you'll see at the bottom, the most recent graduates, as you know now, those who graduated between 2011 and 2017, that's the number that has risen to 22%. In other words, the more recent graduates are going into science at the same level as from other schools. You may also know that by now, in Europe, there is a famous Waldorf graduate, a Nobel Prize winner in biology, Thomas Stutthof, who was himself a Waldorf graduate. So that was the first myth. The second myth we wish to dispel was to say that if you go to a Waldorf school, you're doomed to become an artist. And to make this comparison now, we look not only to see how the Waldorf school graduates fared and where they went, but also then where students went from other independent schools, and also then a comparison to the US population in general. And now we can go to the next slide. If you can see it, it might be a little small in the print. But if you can see it, if you pinned it or if you've gone to the speaker view for it, then you may notice that if you go to the left-hand side of this chart of employment, by far the greatest percentage of Waldorf graduates go into the areas of education, health, and social services. I have to mention, by the way, in passing, that these categories are provided by the US government, and they sometimes combine some very strange bedfellows. And you'll see in a moment what I mean by that. But nonetheless, we can subdivide this first column on the left there between education, 23%, which is to say that almost a quarter of Waldorf graduates that we surveyed ended up teaching or being involved in some way in education, and roughly 12 or so percent ended up as in the health professions, so doctors, nurses, things like that, out of this total of roughly a third of the Waldorf graduates in this area. The second bar graph, you'll notice the Waldorf graduates are a bit fewer than the other independent schools, but about the same as the national population. And this, in case you can't read it, these are representing the areas of profession, business, and other services. Again, Waldorf graduates tend to be less in business, more in other subjects, but nonetheless, you'll see that there's still a strong showing in the professional business world. And then just a couple more, the third bar, or third set of bars, this is the weird one from the US government point of view here, because they've combined the fine arts, the performing arts, the leisure arts, and hospitality arts, that is to say, running a hotel, the art of hotel management, perhaps. So for some reason, these are all thrown together as one profession. And there you'll see that the Waldorf School is well represented, I think primarily through the arts, less so, I think, through running a hotel. And the last set of bars going from the left, or the fourth from the left, these are science, engineering, transportation, and utilities. Again, strange combinations provided by the US government. But again, you'll see that the percentage of Waldorf graduates going into these areas is about the same as from other independent schools, a bit more than the general population. And then as you work your way further along this slide, you'll notice the Waldorf school numbers go down as the general population goes up, until you get to the very end, the fairly right of your screen, where the blue and the red are more or less the same size. The population on the right, the gray, less so. These are so-called other things. And that's a whole range of things, too complicated to give in detail. To say in one word here what is going on, we looked at these professions generally, and we're able to say that roughly 40% of Waldorf graduates end up in what you might call the helping professions. The helping professions. That is to say, a profession that works for the service of others. Let's go to the next slide, which takes us now to the strengths and weaknesses of education according to those who took it. Again, we're comparing Waldorf on the left to other independent schools, the NAIS schools on the right. What we found striking was that out of the 5 most cited strengths, 4 were the same in the Waldorf school compared to the other independent schools. The only difference, as you'll see, is that in the Waldorf schools, the arts, not surprisingly, the arts were listed as a strong strength. And in the other independent schools, they listed advanced courses, which in Waldorf schools we don't offer. How about weaknesses? Again, there were similarities. Next slide. And you'll notice that among the weaknesses, yes, the Waldorf school students did often cite engineering, that is IT, science, and math. Though it was so interesting in the narrative section to realize that many students wrote something like, I had very much difficulty transitioning into science in my college degree, comma, but now I'm in a PhD program for thermodynamics. In other words, in many cases, they found their way into science, even if there was a transition that was a bit bumpy out of their Waldorf experience. Still, they're listed there as some of the weaknesses. Notice there are 2 that are shared, however, with other independent schools, diversity being one, and that is a huge topic right now, to make the Waldorf schools across the world, but especially in North America, more diverse, but that's felt more generally in independent education. And otherwise, the academic facilities, the buildings, the equipment was also sometimes the object of complaint in both Waldorf schools and independent schools generally. Notice in passing that in the independent schools, they listed arts as a weakness, something that in Waldorf schools we list as a strength. Let's go to the next slide, which kind of sums up this part of the survey from a Waldorf graduate who kind of captured an element, I think, of the education in saying, as he or she said, that so many seeds, again, the prophetic nature, so many seeds were planted. Even just now, she or he is saying, is beginning to break open above the soil. So many things that teachers told me that I didn't understand at the time, now I feel that I do. Now, finally, the third myth. Here we tried to see if we could get a grip on this myth that somehow Waldorf teachers are secretly teaching their students anthroposophy. And so we asked a question of our students about anthroposophy and their relationship to it. Let's go to the next slide. The most common response, 43%, they were either indifferent or didn't even know what anthroposophy was. Had to look it up. Didn't know after 15 years what it was. The most common response was not applicable, or the other one was, what is anthroposophy? We also had other responses that were more negative, about 14%. And then we had a number that were actually positive about their relationship to anthroposophy. That number was 43% also. So the number that were positive and the number that were indifferent, the same, a few negatives as well. We got one specific response from a very wise parent or a wise Waldorf graduate who described the following in the next slide. He says, my wife relates to anthroposophy more than I do. My eyes glaze over. He goes on to say, I'm aligned with my wife, but I stay out of the conversations. Finally, we had one other question for our students. We asked them, would you send your child to a Waldorf school? And the next slide has the answers. Over half said yes, sometimes with the reservations about the cost and the distance. Little less than half, 44%, said no, primarily for those two reasons, cost and distance, although sometimes other reasons too, like lack of diversity, were mentioned. Another question, though, we asked, namely, would you recommend Waldorf Education to your family or friends? There, fully 85% responded with the answer, yes, they would. And some went further to say that they had taken up some of the habits of Waldorf Education into their own parenting, that is, the own education of their children, specifically by limiting television or by introducing play or life in nature, bedtime stories, and so forth. I will finish with one final quote here from one student who said this at her graduation as part of her graduation speech. And the last slide, almost last slide, will tell you. Here it is. She says, as you can read it, what makes a Waldorf school are the teachers. They don't just teach the student of 15 or 18, but they teach who that person will be at 28 and 48. In other words, they try to teach who we will become. Again, the theme of prophetic teaching is sounded there. I apologize if that was very quick or too surface, but the next slide will tell you where you can go for further details. This is a book that was published by a colleague of mine and with me that goes into much more detail about the survey conducted of these graduates. So let's take that away and move on then to the next part. Because as you can appreciate, this survey was published in January of last year, so January 2020. And that, as you know, was the same month when we first began to have signs of the COVID pandemic overtaking us. And in those times of COVID, we know from many, many other studies now how much teenagers were affected by this pandemic. And they were affected partly because of the fact that much of what they valued about their education was denied them, having to do with one thing in particular. It has to do with the theme of movement. Teenagers learn by moving. Again, it bears on this understanding of metabolism and the limbs. They learn by moving. All students learn by moving, but teenagers especially learn by moving. And COVID, as you know, among other things, inhibited movement in many ways, physical, but also psychological, even spiritual. Now, what happens if you are inhibited in your movement? If you are inhibited in your movement, the risk is that anxiety rises. But the reverse is also the case. If you are more anxious, the tendency is for you to inhibit movement. Now, in the case of adults, it's obvious that adults have been very much affected also by the times of COVID, with rising mental distress. In fact, one survey says that adults this year are 3 times more likely to have documented and diagnosed mental distress compared to the time before COVID. It's been a huge, huge change. And there have been similar studies with the teenagers. However, I came across an interesting study that suggested that in the case of some teenagers at least, it looks as though the pandemic may actually have helped them. One study in Canada, one study in the United States, looked at a couple of issues and noticed that the level of anxiety which we expected to rise with teenagers, as it seems to have done in some aspects, in other aspects, anxiety and also stress was lowered. Why? A few reasons. First, in the time of the pandemic, teenagers have been sleeping more because they're not going to school, or they're going to school virtually at a later hour. One study said that the number of teenagers who were sleeping 7 hours plus per night, which is the recommended minimum, about 55% of them were sleeping that adequate amount in 2018, prior to COVID. 2 years later, 2020, that number had gone up from 55% to 85% were sleeping 7 hours and more. I think that helps with anxiety. Second, half of the teenagers in 2 of these surveys reported that they were spending more time with their family. Now that might be the cause of more stress, but I don't think so because of the next thing. And that is that these same students in the Canadian and US survey, 2/3 of them said they were having closer relationships with their families. And assuming closer is positive, one can assume that the time was also not so stressful. With regard to screen use, this was interesting. These surveys established that the use of screen did not rise, but it changed. That is to say, the students spent less time with gaming and texting and social media, which are very stress-inducing, by the way, especially for girls. And rather, the screen time was spent more with television, videos, movies, and of course, school. Finally, out of this survey, it was suggested that 53%, over half again, 53% of these teenagers said the pandemic had made them feel stronger. And that's important to remember, that teenagers sometimes don't always behave the way the rest of us think they should. Before I move on, just a couple of anecdotal remarks that came from some teachers I spoke to, Waldorf teachers. First, especially when the students began to return to online or return from online to in-person learning, many of the teachers noticed that the children, the teenagers, were almost a year younger than their age group normally would be. It's almost as if their emotional development stayed steady for the time they were at home working online. Second, another teacher said, once the students came back into the school face-to-face, they needed what this teacher called verbal cuddling. They needed to be together and talk together and bavarder and just sort of chit-chat, which they do anyway. But especially in this case, once they came back together, almost a need, a craving for verbal meeting and mingling. Many schools had to introduce new curriculum that brought the students more actively together. There was one school that introduced a whole curriculum of cooking so that students could work together and form a social, biological, metabolic union among themselves. Another school had introduced a greater performance of tests that were conducted of groups. So rather than each individual student having his or her own test and suffering the stresses that go with that, the anxieties that go with that, no, the tests were administered to a group, and the group got the grade, and the group got to defend its answers to particular questions. And the last thing I mentioned from these individual remarks from teachers is this came from a sculpture teacher and also from a math teacher. They noticed, as they said, that the students coming back into school had difficulty penetrating the third dimension. In clay, in the sculpture studio, in math with understanding projective geometry, anything to do with perspective. It's almost as though the students had developed a two-dimensional screen consciousness out of this year at home, or at least the year on screen, and in so doing had lost the muscle, should we say, the ability inwardly, but also even outwardly through their hands to reach into the third dimension. And so with that, I want to circle back now, finally, to the fourth part, to take up the theme again of the task of now high school education in these times of COVID. And I want to suggest to you that although COVID has exaggerated certain tendencies, a lot of what COVID is doing, in fact, is not so much causing as simply bringing to consciousness trends that have already been underway for quite some years. At least in the United States, we have to say that since, as of 2020, all children in school, including all teenagers, even all seniors, all children in school were born after September 11th, 2001. And you know the significance of that date. Children, therefore, born, all of them, into an age of heightened societal and parental and personal anxiety. Or to put it in terms of the physical body, they were born into a body, into a social body, in which the nervous system is of heightened activity. Now, you will know from yourself that if your nervous system is in heightened activity, your system of metabolism and the limbs that go with it will be inhibited. I won't do it now, but if I were to make a sudden and loud sound, your nervous system would go into hyperactivity and your metabolism would momentarily be cramped. Those two go together. The reverse, by the way, is also the case. If you have a huge meal, then the nervous system tends to shut down. In this country, we're about to engage in the Thanksgiving dinner. Many families will come together. They will have a huge and very fat-filled meal. And after this big meal, and they begin to digest this meal, the best they can hope to do is to watch a little football on television to stay awake. Those two are complementary. Now, it's interesting that Rudolf Steiner foresaw this development, this tendency for overactivity of the nervous system. He foresaw this a century ago in a very famous lecture called, in English, called Overcoming Nervousness. Nervosität und Ichheit in German, in which Rudolf Steiner predicted what he called an epidemic of nervousness. His remedy, which he then offered 7 years later, in 1919, was the Waldorf School. The Waldorf School was intended to address this growing epidemic of nervousness or anxiety. And that brings me then to a consideration of three aspects of Waldorf education, and specifically how it addresses this one-sidedness in our nervous disposition at the cost of our metabolism and will. I wish to speak briefly then about three kinds of intelligence, two of which are very familiar. There is, first of all, what you might call cognitive intelligence, that is to say, an intelligence of our thinking. That is to say, a kind of intelligence which requires the activity of our nervous system. What is interesting, though, is if you wish to develop this nervous system, wish to develop this cognitive intelligence, the best way, we now have evidence for this, the best way is to engage in motor activity, so-called sensory motor activity. That's a very abstract way of saying play. Play is a great example of sensory motor self-generated activity. That will do more to develop cognitive intelligence, especially in the early years, than anything else you can do. The second form of intelligence is also fairly well known. It's become more part of common discourse in the last century, I have to say. And that is what you might say the intelligence of the feeling life, what we now call emotional intelligence. That is to say, the intelligence of the feeling realm, the middle realm, the intelligence, you might say, of heart and lung. And again, we have very documented evidence, some of it in my references, very documented evidence of how one can develop that emotional intelligence. And how do you develop it? You develop it in many ways, but a very potent way to develop emotional intelligence is through the practice of the arts. The Dana Foundation, for example, has done a very expensive multi-million-dollar research to show that the performance of the arts, ballet, music, they also contribute to cognitive intelligence through advanced skill in math, but they also help to develop what we would call emotional intelligence in the middle realm. But what I find sometimes overlooked is the development and the necessary development of a third form of intelligence, related, of course, to cognitive intelligence, certainly related to emotional maturity, emotional intelligence, but it is what you might call metabolic intelligence, or what you might call gut intelligence, intelligence of the will. And I will call that moral intelligence. And there was some very interesting research done by Christine Heather, in which she worked with various groups. I won't go into details now, but she worked with various groups, including Waldorf graduates, compared them then to students who had not gone to a Waldorf school and also to a general population. And she established that the Waldorf graduates scored on a test of morality so high that she had to go looking for another group outside adolescence to find a comparable group that was sufficiently or comparably developed in their moral intelligence. She found a group, by the way, finally, that had the same level of moral development in a group of second-year divinity students. And she wondered, why was it that the Waldorf students had developed this moral intelligence according to this test, the test of Kohlberg, this test in such a high degree? It was speculative. She said, well, could it be the fact that in Waldorf schools we work with the whole human being? Could that be something that helps moral intelligence? She asked, could it be that in Waldorf schools we have developmental stages, preschool, lower school, high school, for the child, and that's reflected in the curriculum? Could that have something to do with development of moral intelligence? And then she had three more reasons, which I can group under one single word. The three things she speculated was, well, could storytelling have something to do with moral intelligence? Could the arts, the practice of the arts, also have something to do with that? And could it be that the emphasis upon the experience of wonder, especially in the lower school, could that also have something to do with the development of moral intelligence? I'll group those three together under a single word, but I want to use this word in a special way. And this is what you might call, with storytelling, with the arts, and the sense of wonder, I will call that imagination, but I mean imagination as a way of knowing the world. I don't mean what is normally meant by imagination, which is either fanciful ideas or wishes or dreams or allegories, or not even mental pictures. Rudolf Steiner makes a big distinction between mental pictures that in a way draw out of your past, out of your experience, and you can look at them on the one hand, and imagination, which he says is not like a mental picture to look at. An imagination is something that you're in, and it's something that is created in the moment, not out of your experience. In the moment, it's almost like it's drawing something out of the unyet formed future. I have a quick example of that. When I was in fourth grade, you heard I went to a Waldorf school. My class teacher was a legendary storyteller, professional storyteller. And I can remember now, 16 more years later, her telling a very simple story about a goose pulling a pumpkin with a chain through the air. What could be simpler than that? And I could remember picturing, because I had experienced, a goose and a chain and a pumpkin. But at a certain moment in her telling of the story, I found myself inside the pumpkin, looking out at the world flying by underneath me. And that was not in the story. I had moved from picturing mentally to what I think Steiner meant by imagining inwardly. In other words, this is now storytelling from the inside out as opposed to the on-site at. And this capacity being able to step into something without losing yourself, this is a very special capacity. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, called it the exemplastic power, the exemplastic power. More familiar to you, perhaps, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe called this the metamorphic thinking, the capacity to metamorph something in your thinking. And for the purpose of today, I will call this capacity of imagination as a way of knowing, I will call this triune thinking. I say triune in order to distinguish it from what much of our thinking is, which in a way is sort of binary. Or put it differently, I'd like to imagine a kind of thinking that moves from a two-dimensional or screen, shall we say, approach to a three-dimensional way of thinking in which you begin to pick up depth. I'm sure you've all had this experience. You go to the theater, the opera, and you're sitting there and a scene is played out in front of the curtain. And you watch that scene in front of the curtain. The scene ends, the actors or singers go off stage, the lights change, and suddenly the backdrop of the curtain becomes invisible. And behind, shall we say beyond, this now invisible screen, a three-dimensional stage opens up. You know that experience. This is a moment of observing a scrim. A scrim screen, which when lit in one way is opaque, and you can play in front of it. There's a backdrop. Lights change, scrim disappears. You see through the scrim into a three-dimensional scene beyond it. That's the kind of shift I'm trying to get at. Or put it differently, a shift from screen thinking or two-dimensional thinking to what you might call sculptural thinking, or the ability to move out of two dimensions into three. And this may sound a bit abstract, so a quick example of that might be relevant here. I remember working with a botanist once and studying the growth of a plant. And you know how a plant grows. It grows up, gets a bit thicker, gets bigger, reaches for the sky. And you could imagine, therefore, a plant growing up. Yeah. But then, in working with him, a whole new picture emerged of how a plant grows, because as you know, the plant doesn't grow from the bottom, it grows from the periphery. All the growth is in the periphery. The buds are there. And in that sense, you can watch a plant not simply growing up, you can watch a plant growing in or down from the crown, from the periphery inwards, as opposed to from the root upwards. And there are more examples like that. But if you've had experiences in which your assumptions about how something happens is completely involuted, that's also a moment of moving, I think, from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, or from what you might call binary to what I'm trying to call triune thinking. Or if you're studying the heart, and again, we have common assumptions about how the heart moves the heart, and the heart moves the blood around the body under a certain pressure. And then you come to recognize that when the arterial blood has to be released out of the capillaries and then be taken back up by the venous arterial venules in order to go back to the heart, the blood that was pushed, so to speak, out of the heart under pressure has lost all of its pressure by the moment of transition, because if there were any pressure at this delicate moment of the capillaries would burst. No, the transition has to be almost without any kind of pressure, and therefore the venous return is almost pressureless. Now, what happened to the pump then, if the pressure is gone? And there are different examples for the heart to say that it's not the heart that pushes the blood, at least it does, not all the way, but at a certain point, the heart actually slows the flow of blood. There are moments when it does accelerate it, but in general, one has to say the heart works as much to slow the blood as to speed the blood. And these ideas in which your assumptions are involuted, these might be examples of moving from what I call two-dimensional to three, or from binary to triune thinking. And to finish then with just a couple further examples. Why do I call this triune? First, because in this imaginative exercise, you're moving from your perspective into another perspective, without, however, losing your own perspective. In that sense, you're rocking, shall we say, from your perspective, your moccasins, into the perspective, into the moccasins of another, and back again, and fro and back, and fro and back. And in that twofold movement, an insight, a new way of seeing, a third perspective can open up. This is like fire between fuel and absence of the fuel. In Goethe's example, famously, with dark and light, color arising not within the one side in light, but you know full well, if you've done prismatic experiments with it, in Goethe's work, dark and light give rise to color between dark and light, a third reality arising between two others. Or if you are musically disposed, recognize then, if you have a note and another note, you can sound one note, you can sound the second note. But from a musical perspective, when the two notes are sounded together, then something different from a note and a note arises, called an interval. And this medium, unfortunately, does not allow me to illustrate that. So you have to inwardly hear it. But hear a note, hear another note. Let's say hear the note C on the piano, hear the note E on the piano, and then you hear the interval. And notice how that interval between C and E is different, whether you put a G above the E or if you put an A below the C. The first, a major chord, the second, a minor chord. The interval on the surface is the same. But what arises between these two notes is different from the sounding of the notes themselves. That's why I call it tri. And why do I call it un? Because in this activity, you are united with the thing you are observing, the phenomenon or the person or the perspective. In that sense, you meet the other in some shared universal. And I can go further to finish here. I can go further by saying that in exercising imagination as a way of knowing, yes, we enter the perspective of the other. We see the universal from his or her point of view. And this is like, in a way, the perspective of a teacher who, wrestling with a child who has trouble with math, if the teacher can enter the perspective of the child, then the teacher can help the child. That's why sometimes teachers who have themselves struggled with math are the best math teachers. Or from literature, the famous example, of course, in which Parzival has to learn to enter the moccasins of the ailing king, Amfortas, in order to put the right question that can heal. This is an example of moral intelligence. An intelligence where the will, or better said, where through will, an idea can be elevated to ideal. That is, where a thought becomes saturated with feeling, to be sure, but also volition, because it's an ideal. It's when a noun, for example, becomes a verb, because something that is static is set in motion, like that third gesture that was represented earlier. And where a name becomes an activity. Wonderful example that Gillard brought in his talk, where he described, you may remember, those Arab children going off out because they had something of their Waldorf experience waiting for them in the outside, either to play a game or do woodwork or something there, or an activity. And the children would say, okay, we're now going outside to Waldorf. That is, Waldorf elevated from noun, name to verb, activity, Waldorfing. So my hope is that in working with teenagers, we learn to bring the wealth of Waldorf education, both cognitive and emotional, and above all moral, to bear. Because if we can do truly our Waldorf education, that is to say, make it an activity to do Waldorfing, I think we will serve them well, first to prepare them, and secondly, to launch them into their life. I think I will stop there, Joost, and take a chance now for further comments and questions from the group. I hope I didn't lay on too many logs too tight, but now there is some space. But before we go to that, Peter, I'm going to invite you back to one more time lets us hear of sound this poem, and then we'll take the questions. I will start. I hope you're pinned. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space.
Too much of a good thing, too many logs, packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would.
So, building fires requires attention to the spaces in between.
As much as to the wood.
When we are able to build open spaces,
In the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel.
and absence of the fuel together, that make fire possible.
That make fire possible. We only need to lay a log
Lightly.
from time to time.
A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame
That knows just how it wants to burn can find its way.
can find its way. Thank you very much. And now let's have Joost come back and see where we take this talk.
Yes, thank you so much, Douglas. There were many perspectives you gave to us, and I'm sure there are many questions or comments to that. Thank you, Peter, also for this poem. That was wonderful to listen to the two of you. So let's wait for the comments or the questions in the chat. I just open it.
And while you're developing your thoughts there, I will offer a word of thanks to you all for participating, A, with the gestures, and B, then with the suggestions on how to characterize this adolescent enthusiasm, this adolescent schwung that they so need.
Maybe I start with the question. I was, thinking about the survey you did, and this was now a survey done in the US, and you are well aware there's also a survey done in Germany, and maybe there are other countries too. I know from Switzerland, for example, but I'm not aware. Maybe there are many other countries where has been some alumni surveys of Waldorf students. So are you aware, are there differences in the countries, or is it or are significant differences concerning the questions? So is Waldorf different, maybe situated in a that the differences may not be related to the different schools, but maybe to the different parents sending their students to the school? That might be interesting.
Now, the quick answer, yours, to that question is to say that the differences exist not so much between countries, but between the time the children come into the Waldorf school. There was one study done in Europe, for example. They looked at children who joined in the first grade, second grade, and third grade, and fourth, and then those who joined later on. And they drew the inference from their research that the most potent differences in the Waldorf student could be seen with those students who were there from the beginning or joined no later than fourth grade. After fourth grade, the differences between Waldorf and other students was decidedly less. That's one thing I've come across. Another difference I observed was that in some surveys, for example, one done in Sweden, one done in Austria, there they were able to establish that in the case of the Waldorf students, they had a much, shall we say, a much healthier health profile in terms of different illnesses, with the exception with hay fever. I don't know why Waldorf kids had more hay fever, but generally they had a lower profile of illness. And we were unable to replicate that in the United States because we discovered when we asked that question of our graduates, a majority of the students refused to answer the question. And we couldn't figure out why until afterwards we realized that in the United States, unlike other parts of the world, in the United States, also to some degree in Canada, health information is very dangerous to share. And there are many reasons for that. And therefore, students tend not to reveal that. So we couldn't make a comparison there. But I would say that to the degree that the groups were comparable, i.e. Waldorf lifers, the results were very similar. And I will say also that in the most recent survey we did, over half of our respondents were what we call Waldorf lifers. That is, they were there right the way from kindergarten, first grade through 12th grade.
It might be also interesting to know, especially for the situation in the US, and maybe that has been already covered by your surveys, the difference between charter school, Waldorf charter schools and other Waldorf schools, if there are any differences appear.
I will say that no studies have been done so far.
Okay.
The population of the charter school is relatively new. And also you have to bear in mind that there are overriding differences in those two populations, Waldorf independent.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, and those overriding differences probably are more influential than anything a Waldorf school can do. And those overriding variables, and this is true of every survey in everything to do with education of children, these three overriding or primary influences are, I hate to say it this way, but here we go, has to do with how much do your parents earn financially? What is their, I love this phrase, what is their terminal degree, their highest degree? What's the degree that killed them off? What's their terminal degree? And I have to say, what is the color of their skin? These three factors you have to control if you want to compare any two groups. And once you've made that control, then you can infer other influences. And you can appreciate, I'm sure, that in terms of the independent Waldorf school background and the public school background, there are enormous differences on all three of those variables, and those have to be factored in first.
Yeah, but that would be rather interesting to know how the outcome is, if you have that in mind, because, you know, it's a totally different setting of doing Waldorf, and this is interesting how it reflects on the results of a survey. Yeah.
And just to add also to that, that in terms of the public sector, you know, one can speak about Waldorf schools, independent schools with a certain generality. The moment you start talking about charter schools, and some of them are charter, some of them are state, they're not all charter. Once you start talking about state-funded Waldorf schools, they are very, very, very different. And that, again, is dangerous, therefore, to clump them all together and say, here we have independent schools and here we have charter schools. They're not nearly as homogeneous in the charter sector.
Okay, so we start with Daphne. Maybe you can put it yourself, Daphne, your question.
Yeah, first I want to say thank you. It was a very inspiring lecture. And I have a question. If I understand correctly, the percentage of STEM students in Waldorf is equal to the percentage of non-Waldorf schools. So has it been checked whether the gender distribution also corresponds to the regular education system, or is there a gender difference?
Now, do you mean gender between Waldorf schools and charters, or Waldorf schools and other independent schools?
Yes.
No, they're about the same. In Waldorf schools, very roughly, the percentage of females is about 55% and boys about 45%. That is changing now, especially we begin to talk about non-binary cases. And that breakdown is approximately the same in other independent schools.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, I'm glad you mentioned that, Daphne, because sometimes that's another myth about Waldorf schools, that Waldorf schools work only for girls. Not true.
Then there's a question by Helen Kinsey. She asked about the difference between those who leave after class 8 and those who, just a moment, and those who stay until class 12.
Yes, differences. There are some, although I will have to say the research is very limited. But you may remember I very briefly skipped over the work of one person who did research into the moral development of teenagers, Christine Heather. She looked at 5 groups. I'm glad you mentioned this question. She looked at 5 groups. So the first group was a group of Waldorf seniors who'd been through the school. Second group, this bears on your question, Helen. The second group were Waldorf students who went through the 8th grade, but then left for a different school and took the test in 12th grade as non-Waldorf high school kids. Third group was a group of seniors from a church-based school. The fourth group was a group of seniors from a non-Waldorf independent school. and the 5th group was a public school group. It was the first group that scored the highest in terms of this moral sophistication. But the second group scored very close, but not quite as high, except in certain areas. Even in certain areas of this moral development, the kids who went through 8th grade, but not the Waldorf High School, scored higher. Don't know why. In other words, there was a difference between the two, but it was not significantly big compared to then the 3rd group, the 4th group, and the 5th group. And the last thing I will say is that both the first group, that is the Waldorf seniors, and the second group, the seniors who didn't go to a Waldorf high school, these were the only 2 groups that offered spontaneous criticisms of the survey. On the answer sheet, they wrote little observations and suggestions on how the questions could be phrased better. And they made critique of some of the assumptions that were built into the questions or the answers to these moral dilemmas that were the basis of this moral test. And they were the only 2 groups that offered that kind of spontaneous critique.
Thank you. The next question comes from Daniel Woolley. Would you say that drama could be particularly useful in the development of this moral intelligence in the high school experience of adolescence?
The quick answer is yes, all the arts. My second answer is yes, especially the performing arts. And by performing arts, I will include certainly drama, but I will mention also music and eurythmy. That is to say, and a speech, any art that has movement in it, explicit. Of course, all arts have movement in it, but explicitly in drama and in music and so forth, you can see the relationship to movement. And there, wherever there is artistic movement, you are, I would say, exercising not only emotional intelligence, but you're indeed working upon moral intelligence, especially then if you think of drama and the capacity to take on a role without becoming the role. That is exactly what I was trying to get at with this notion of triune thinking, that you exit your own perspective, you enter another perspective without losing your own, however. That's the difference between imagination and hallucination. That is, when you hallucinate, you lose your perspective and you enter another one. No, imagination, you retain your own being, your own perspective, even while you entertain another one. And drama, as you can appreciate, is a wonderful way to exercise that capacity to be without losing yourself.
Thank you. Sakunan, maybe you can put your question yourself. It's a bit a complex question.
Oh, no. Thanks for the lovely presentation, Douglas. I just want to know, because I love the way you mentioned the 9 bodily systems. So my question is, you mentioned that body and movement is important to learning and cognition. But at the same time, Waldorf education emphasizes the arts and imagination, even in the movements that they do. And you've just even mentioned about taking perspectives. So would you say that there's an explicit ignorance? That means we explicitly ignore the physiology of the body to allow the imagination and the arts to thrive in Waldorf education?
If I understand your question correctly, I would say the degree to which Waldorf education is Waldorfing, that is, practicing the art of education, we embrace all 10 bodily systems. And therefore, if that's not happening, that's not a function of Waldorf education, that's a function of an incomplete Waldorf education. In other words, if Waldorf education is doing what it's trying to do, that is to say, studying the entirety of the human organism and exercising all aspects of it, cognitive, emotional, volitional, yes, 9 bodily systems, and the skin, which is the 10th system above all, there, Waldorf education should be exercising the whole human being. And I would say, therefore, that if it's working well, Waldorf education should, in a certain sense, match or be a kind of a counter picture to the construction or the formation or the systems of the human physical body. Is that addressing your question? I wasn't quite sure about the last part.
No. I'm not denying the fact that it activates all these bodily systems, but I'm saying that because of the arts and the imagination involved in Waldorf education, we have to purposefully ignore it, so the arts and ignore it in the students. That means students are not explicitly told that, this bodily system is working. Physiology, the physiological aspects and the science aspect of it is downplayed for Waldorf education to thrive? That's what I was asking. So
Yes.
I do not deny that all these are activated. I agree with it totally, and that's what attracts me to the Waldorf education.
Yes, thank you. I understand your question better now. You can think of Waldorf educators as plumbers. Their job is to build everything that's behind the wall. You don't have plumbers, except in the Centre Pompidou in Paris. You don't have plumbers revealing their work. We have people right now in our house that are rebuilding our bathroom, and they're doing a wonderful job of hiding everything they're doing. So we see a beautiful wall, but we know because they're plumbers, they've been very active behind the scenes. And yes, you're quite right. We don't tell our kids what we're doing. That would ruin it. It's like giving the end of the joke before you tell the story.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
So there's an interesting question by Elsa. So if there is such a focus on moral development, how about Waldorf graduates in politics and global affairs? Does that has any effect on them? Are there Waldorf graduates who are really bring their moral education into the world actively?
I wish I had a quick answer for that question, and I don't. Partly, I think, because, and this is, I risk generalizing perhaps, partly because those people who are moral changers, that is, they change a moral setting, they're often not the loudest speakers. They often work very quietly. They often work in the background. And if they work in the background, we don't know necessarily how powerful they are. Now, having said that, there is a website where you can go and you can look at famous Waldorf graduates. I'm sure you'll find it on the website.
It's already in the chat, yeah.
Terrific, okay. So there you find the noisy ones, and sometimes they're very moral. But I think to answer your question, we would have to do a different kind of research, and it would not be research of the most famous Waldorf people, although some of them are very upright, and some in this country were, for example, extremely helpful in the moral dilemma, for example, in 9/11, but that's a different story. But in short, I would say the moral efficacy of Waldorf graduates may be impossible to discern because of the reason that I mentioned. Having said that, I do know anecdotally that there have been people who've sent their children to a Waldorf school because of what they've observed in their neighbors' children who were Waldorf kids or alumni who came back to the school. And these other parents noticed something about these children to say, I want my kid to be like that. I don't know quite what that is, but I want my kid to be like that. And then they put their own kids in the Waldorf school for reasons they can't quite articulate, but I think it bears on your question.
Maybe I can tell something we are doing right now. We are starting a research project in Germany, doing a survey concerning the ecological consciousness and also the ecological attitude of Waldorf students in relation to regular school students. So the question, is there any impact on the ecological consciousness and attitude of Waldorf students? Because we do a lot of nature education in Waldorf schools, but we don't know if it has an effect on not only knowing about ecological aspects, but the behavior. Is there a different behavior? Is there a different attitude developed? And so we compare, I don't know, Laura, how is it, 10 Waldorf schools and 10 regular schools? And it's the same area, so it's the same social background, so to speak, so that there is, we can have a real, we are able to compare that, and we are really looking for the outcome of that. So that might be interesting. What is the effect on Waldorf towards ecological consciousness?
I could broaden that comment, Jos, by something that Elna said there about Namibia, which I think is very important. That is to say, if you engage in these activities, she mentions them, storytelling, reverence, and the arts, it doesn't matter if you're doing it inside a Waldorf school or not. You are Waldorfing. You're elevating the education to a verb, and you don't need a building to do that. As Gillard mentioned already last time, there are many ways to do Waldorf. You don't have to do it in a place that has a shingle hanging outside saying Waldorf school. So that's for, if you work in this way, you are Waldorfing. The difference may be, of course, that in the Waldorf school, if you're aware of this reality, aware of this potency, then of course you can apply it all the more specifically. And by being like a lens, you can focus the capacity, and by focusing the light, you can make it more potent. But the light is everywhere. And if you wish to have your own lens, by all means, borrow the light and have a Waldorf.
Christoph, you were going to say something.
Douglas, thank you very much for your wonderful words. I still have a little question about the development of morals. Do I understand what you are saying well when I distinguish between moral imagination and moral technique, as Steiner pointed that out in the philosophy of freedom? I guess as a school, we are able to bring moral technique, but moral imagination is something that comes out of the, just as you said, out of the periphery of all our education. Is that in line with what you have said, or is that a total other aspect?
Both. It is in line and it's different. And that's why I spoke of moral intelligence. So if you were to imagine moral intelligence as being a bit like antennae, which can reach out and then receive signals, then I would imagine what I'm trying to characterize as moral intelligence is the development and the sensitizing of these antennae. And moral imagination, as you characterizing it, and as Rudolf Steiner characterizes it, that then comes towards you, and then you can recognize it as your own. Because we also are not only in here, we are also out there. We are as much peripheral beings as we are central beings. And to the degree that we connect our centrality with our peripherality, if that's a word, we are connecting our moral intelligence to our moral imagination. And of course, the enactment of that moral imagination is what you called moral technique.
I understood that the moral technique is just this antennas. Steiner gave that example of helping an old lady crossing the street. Therefore, you need these antennas. The development of the awareness of your being in the world.
Yes, and that comes in two parts. One is the awareness, and then the second part is, what do I do practically? What do I actually do in this situation? You know? And if you may know the famous example of the US airline pilot who landed a plane in the Hudson River.
Yes.
So that's an example. Here he had lots of training, and the training told him that if the engine's cut out, you basically coast back to LaGuardia Airport and land safely on the tarmac. But he, in the moment, knew different. Not to say it's a moral question, but it's like a moral question. He, in the moment, with his antennae fully developed, not just trained on what to do in circumstances, but what to do in a circumstance you'd never prepared for. That's what I call moral intelligence. And then the practical application is land in the Hudson River.
Precisely. Yeah. And that's a practical application could be a moral technique.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Joost, I know we're coming to the end here.
Yes.
And there's one thought I wanted to pick up from something that you said in one of your talks about the importance for the teenager of truth. You talked about that. And I thought it might be worth just saying a sentence there, which I wanted to bring to bear because there wasn't time earlier on. Because I think it's crucial what you said there about the importance of truth in the life of the teenager. But I would offer that in three aspects related to these three intelligences. Because I would say, and I hope it's the case beyond North America, I'm pretty sure it is, that wherever you find teenagers, I would say they're yearning for three things. They're yearning, on the one hand, they're yearning for finding true meaning in the world. And that requires a living cognitive intelligence. A higher kind of thinking, you might say. However, also I would say teenagers are yearning to find true love. And that could be of a person or a cause or an abstract idea or ideal. But nonetheless, they are seeking true love. And that requires more than cognitive, that requires a matured emotional intelligence. But let's not overlook the fact that I think deep down, teenagers also are yearning for what you might call finding a true purpose in life. And that's different from what you can think and you can feel. This is, what shall I do? Why am I here? And I would say, in order to discern the true purpose, my true purpose for being here, that requires this metabolic, this third, this triune, this moral intelligence as well.
Thank you so much for those important last words. Thank you so much, Douglas. That was wonderful. So we have reached the end of our time. Thank you to Douglas and Peter for that presentation. And I'd like to announce the next presentation. This will be by Johannes Wagemann, who is professor at Alanus University in Mannheim. And he's going to speak about consciousness development in Waldorf Education. He is doing consciousness research in his work, and we are looking forward to that lecture next Tuesday. So have a good day, have a good night, all the best for you. Goodbye. Looking forward to see you all again.
Thank you, Douglas.
Downwards.